Welcome back to True Crime is Sleepy. Close your eyes. Listen. Listen past the sound of the soft rain on the glass to the sound of an unnatural silence. On the 2nd of February 1933, in Le Mans, France, that silence was all a man named René Lancelin could hear. He stood at his own front door, turning his key in the lock. But the door wouldn't open. It was bolted from the inside. What the police found when they broke down that door would become one of the most infamous crimes in French history. It was a scene of unparalleled brutality. But what they found in the attic, in the small maid's room, was even more disturbing. Two sisters, Christine and Léa Papin, lying naked in the same bed, their bloody hammer resting neatly on a chair nearby. They confessed immediately. The what of this crime is horrific, but the why is what we are here to understand. This wasn't a robbery. This was a psychological implosion, a shared madness that had been building in silence for 20 years. It was approximately 6:30 in the evening when Monsieur Lancelin first arrived home. The street, Rue Bruyère, was quiet. He was a retired solicitor, a man of routine and expectation. His first expectation was that his wife, Léonie, and his daughter, Geneviève, would be waiting. His second was that the door would be unlocked. It was not. He called out. There was no answer. He tried the key again. The door held firm. The internal bolt slid shut. This was the first anomaly. This was the first prick of dread. He went to a nearby friend's house, confused, perhaps annoyed. He was accompanied back to the house by his son-in-law. Together, they tried the door again, rattling it, calling out the names of the women inside. The house remained dark. It remained silent. At this point, the dread began to crystallize. They walked around the perimeter of the house, checking other doors, peering into the black windows. Every entry point was secured from within. It was time to call the police. When the officers arrived, the decision was made quickly. The front door had to be forced. With a splintering crack, the lock gave way, and the men stepped inside, their torches cutting beams through the pitch-black foyer. The house was cold, the air was still, and the switch for the electric lights did nothing. The home was powerless. The group moved cautiously through the ground floor. Nothing seemed disturbed. No signs of a robbery, no furniture overturned. It was just empty. Then, one of the officers looked up the main staircase. There, on the second-floor landing, a single candle flickered. It was the only source of light in the entire house, its small flame dancing in the drafts created by the broken door. The men began to ascend the stairs. As they climbed, the first inconsistency reached them, a smell. It was coppery and thick, the unmistakable scent of blood. On the landing, the candlelight revealed the source. The scene was one of total, incomprehensible carnage. It was later described by the medical examiner as a butchery. The first body they found was that of Geneviève, the daughter. She was lying on her back. Her face was gone. It had been reduced to a pulp, a crimson mask of tissue and shattered bone. A few feet away lay her mother, Madame Léonie Lancelin. Her fate had been the same. The level of violence inflicted upon them was so extreme that they were, for all intents and purposes, unrecognizable. Their skirts were hiked up, their bodies battered, but the focus of the assault had been their heads. The walls of the landing were spattered with blood. The weapons were scattered nearby, a heavy pewter pitcher now dented and dark, a kitchen knife, a hammer. But amidst this tableau of rage, one detail was so specific, so grotesque, that it elevated the crime from mere brutality to something ritualistic, something psychologically profound. The victim's eyes had been removed. The officers, hardened as they were stunned into silence. This was not a murder. This was an exorcism. A search of the immediate area revealed the eyes of Madame Lancelin resting in the folds of her own silk scarf, which had been tossed near her body. Her daughter's eyes were found under her body. They had been, the coroner would later confirm, enucleated while the women were likely still alive. The house was a tomb. The question now was, where were the killers, and where were the maids? The officers, weapons drawn, moved to the next level, the top floor, the attic. This was where the maids, Christine and Leah Papin, had their small room. They reached the top of the narrow attic stairs and found another door. And just like the front door, this one was also locked, bolted from the inside. This was the second anomaly, the seeding of a crucial psychological fact. The front door had been locked to keep the world out. This door, it seemed, had been locked to keep themselves in. Again, the police had to force the door. It burst open. And here, the scene shifted from one of hot, chaotic violence to one of cold, surreal calm. The room was neat. It was sparse. Unlike the landing below, nothing here was disturbed. In the center of the room was a small bed. Lying in it, huddled together under a blanket, were the two sisters. Christine, age 27, Leah, age 21. They were both completely naked. They were not hysterical. They were not crying. They seemed, by all accounts, to be in a state of absolute calm. They were just waiting. On a small chair next to the bed, the bloody hammer had been placed, almost neatly, alongside the blood-stained knife. One of the officers, his voice breaking the silence, asked the inevitable question: "What happened here?" It was Christine, the older sister, who replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "It was us. To understand the explosion of violence on that landing, we must rewind the clock. We must go back 20 years to examine the faulty materials and fractured blueprints of the Papin family. The tragedy of February 1933 was not an isolated storm. It was the final, inevitable breaking of a ship that had been sinking since the day it was launched. The story begins with the patriarch, Gustave Papin. By all accounts, Gustave was a volatile man, prone to bouts of anger and heavy drinking. He was a creature of instability. Their mother, Clemence, was his opposite in temperament, not fiery, but cold. She was distant, detached, and pragmatic to a fault. It was not a home of warmth. It was a contractual arrangement, and the children, first an older sister, Amelia, then Christine in 1905, and finally Leah in 1911, were simply accessories to a failing marriage. The family's first catastrophic fracture, the first major crack in the hull, came early. Amelia, the eldest sister, suddenly and without explanation, entered a convent. She took vows to become a nun, disappearing behind the high walls of the church. The reason, which festered like a secret wound within the family, was an accusation that Gustave, her father, had sexually assaulted her. Whether this accusation was true or merely a rumor that Clemence chose to believe, the effect was the same. It was the end of the Papin family unit. Clemence separated from Gustave, and the family shattered. The children, now liabilities in this separation, were scattered. Christine and Leah, still young, were not kept by their mother. Instead, they were handed over to institutions. They were sent to the Bon Pasteur orphanage in Le Mans. The Bon Pasteur was not a place of comfort. It was a place of rigid, Victorian discipline. The girls were taught silence, obedience, and hard labor. They were trained, in essence, for a life of service, a life of being unseen and unheard. Christine, during her time there, actually expressed a desire to follow her older sister Amelia into the convent. She felt a calling. But her mother, Clemence, forbade it. Clemence was a practical woman. A daughter in a convent was a mouth that fed itself. But 2 daughters in a convent was a waste of potential income. And so, as soon as Christine was of working age, Clemence pulled her from the orphanage. She did the same with Leah. They were not retrieved to be part of a family, they were retrieved to be assets. They were put to work as live-in maids. And in these early years, they were almost always separated, working in different houses. They were described as good workers, quiet, efficient, invisible. But Clemence was the beneficiary. She collected their wages, keeping the majority for herself, doling out only a pittance to her daughters. They were earning, but they were not free. This period of separation was crucial. It created in both sisters a deep, aching void, a longing for the only familial connection that hadn't been severed or corrupted. They longed for each other. Eventually, Christine, the elder and more forceful of the two, began to make demands. She would only take a position if Leah could be hired as well. In 1926, this demand was met. They were hired together by the Lancelin family, moving into the house on the Rue Bruyère. Christine as the cook, Leah as the housemaid. This is the moment the closed system was born. The attic room, the room that police would one day break into, became their entire world. Finally reunited, the sisters began to systematically sever their last remaining ties to the outside. The final tie was their mother, Clemence. After years of financial exploitation, they cut her off completely. They stopped responding to her letters, they stopped sending her money. Now, their isolation was total. They had no friends, they did not socialize. They were never seen in town, except for their brief, silent trips to Sunday Mass, always together. They worked together, ate together, and in the small attic room, they slept in the same bed. A world was being built in that room, woven from shared trauma, shared resentment, and a fierce, obsessive loyalty. Inside this system, a powerful dynamic formed. Christine, the elder, was the primary. She was intelligent, articulate when she chose to be, but also more severe, more dominant. Leah, 7 years younger, was the secondary. She was quiet, timid, and utterly submissive to her older sister. She was described as speaking Christine's words, as if she were a mere echo. For 7 years, this system remained stable. They were, by all accounts, perfect maids. Their work was flawless. The Lancelins, a respectable, upper-middle-class family, were pleased with their quiet, efficient servants. But beneath this placid surface, a dangerous psychological pressure was building, and the source of that pressure was Madame Léonie Lancelin. Madame Lancelin was not, by 1930 standards, a cruel employer. She did not beat the sisters, but she was a woman of exacting, obsessive standards. She was meticulous. She was the gaze. It was well known among the staff that Madame Lancelin would often, as a test of their diligence, put on a pair of white gloves. She would run her gloved fingers along the tops of door frames, over mantelpieces, checking for the slightest trace of dust. This small, repeated act, this silent, white-gloved inspection, became, in the paranoid minds of the sisters, an act of profound psychological aggression. It was a constant reminder of their status. It was the look that said, "You are beneath me. You are being judged." In their closed system, with no outside air, no external perspective to normalize these minor indignities, this pressure began to warp their reality. Madame Lancelin became, in their shared delusion, the persecutor. She was the focal point of all the humiliation they had ever endured, from their father's violence to their mother's exploitation to the cold charity of the orphanage. She was the symbol of them, and in the attic room there was only us. This was the state of affairs on February 2nd, 1933, a 20-year-old psychological bomb ticking. That afternoon, something went wrong with the electric iron. It short-circuited, blowing a fuse and plunging the house into darkness. It was not the first time this had happened. The house's wiring was known to be faulty. But when Madame Lancelin and her daughter Geneviève returned home to a dark, cold house, an argument began. We will never know the exact words that were exchanged on that staircase, but it doesn't matter. The argument over the broken iron was not the cause of the murders. It was simply the detonator. It was the final, insignificant tap on the hull of a ship that was already groaning under unimaginable pressure. And in that moment, the hull finally breached, and 2 decades of silent, repressed, shared madness came roaring to the surface. The investigation, in a legal sense, was simple. It was perhaps the shortest investigation in French criminal history. There was no mystery. There was no whodunit. There was only the why. When Christine and Leah were brought before the examining magistrate, they were not defiant, nor were they remorseful. They were, in a word, calm. They recounted the events of that evening with a chilling detachment, as if describing a mundane household chore. They explained in frank detail the argument, the first blow with the pewter pitcher, the retrieval of the hammer and the knife, and the 2-hour frenzy that followed. They seemed to have no grasp of the horror of their actions. Their only concern, their single repeated anxiety, was that they would be separated. They were terrified of being blamed individually. Christine, in her dominant role, tried to take the majority of the blame, but both sisters insisted on their shared responsibility. They were overheard repeating a single phrase to each other, a mantra that defined their closed system. We will share the same fate. This us against the world mentality would define their trial. The trial itself, which began in September 1933, was a sensation. It was not just a trial of 2 maids, it was a trial of France itself. The courtroom was packed. The press from all over the world descended on Le Mans. The public was deeply, violently divided. To one half of the public, the sisters were monsters. They were inhuman she-devils, the product of degenerate bloodlines, their crime an affront to God and civilized society. The brutality, especially the enucleation of the eyes, was seen as proof of their innate evil. But to the other half, particularly the intellectuals and the far left, the sisters were something else entirely. They were seen as revolutionary heroes. Intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir saw the crime not as a simple murder, but as a political act. To them, this was the inevitable, explosive consequence of class warfare. It was the oppressed rising up against the oppressor. The sisters weren't mad. They were the only sane response to an insane system of servitude. The murder was interpreted as a righteous, symbolic execution of the bourgeoisie, and the Papin sisters became reluctant icons of a workers' revolution. But in the courtroom, these complex theories were brushed aside. The trial was a formality. The evidence was absolute. The confession was immediate. The only real question was not if they were guilty, but how guilty. Was this premeditated, or was it a sudden hysterical rage? The defense tried to argue for insanity, pointing to the family's troubled history: the alcoholic father, the uncle who had hanged himself, the grandfather prone to violence. They argued that the sisters were products of a tainted lineage. The prosecution argued for pure, calculated evil. The entire trial lasted only a single day. The jury deliberated for just 40 minutes. Christine Papin, the elder, the dominant primary of the pair, was found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine. Leah Papin, the younger, the submissive secondary, was seen as being under her sister's spell. She was given a lighter sentence, 10 years of hard labor. The legal what was settled. Justice, in the eyes of the court, had been served. But for us, The real investigation, the why, was only just beginning. The court's verdict closed the case, but it failed to explain the locked attic door, the nakedness, the shared calm, or the horrifying, symbolic act of removing the eyes. To understand that, we must leave the courtroom and enter the realm of psychology. The trial gave a legal conclusion, but it offered no psychological closure. It answered the what, but it completely failed to explain the why. Why the locked attic door? Why the shared nakedness? Why the eerie, absolute calm after such a frenzy? And most importantly, why the eyes? To answer these questions, we must use the analytical lenses that the court ignored. The crime of the Papin sisters is not a case of simple murder. It is a textbook, tragic case of a rare psychological phenomenon. This is the first lens, folie à deux, a madness for two. It is a clinical term for a shared psychotic disorder. It is a dark psychological duet, where one mind, the primary, creates a delusion, and another, secondary mind, adopts it as their own. This is not simple influence. It is not just a dominant personality bullying a weaker one. It is a complete and total transference of reality. The two minds merge, creating a new, shared consciousness, a closed system. This system, by its very nature, is paranoid. It defines itself by what it is not. There is us and them. The primary partner is the one who suffers from the original psychotic disorder. They are the engine of the delusion. The secondary partner is usually more submissive, more passive, and, crucially, is isolated with the primary, cut off from any other correcting influences or, in this case, any other reality. This is the psychological blueprint of Christine and Leah Papin. Christine was the primary. She was the older, intelligent, dominant sister. She was the one who, in the isolation of that attic, began to develop a genuine paranoid disorder. Leah was the perfect secondary, submissive, younger, and completely devoted to her sister, her only anchor in the world. Think back to the seeding of this analysis, the details from Hoi 1 and 2. We talked about their childhood, the abusive father, the exploitative mother, the cold orphanage. They were two people who had learned that the outside world was a source of nothing but trauma, exploitation, and pain. Their reunion in the Lancelin house wasn't just a family getting back together. It was two survivors building a fortress. That attic room, which they insisted on sharing, became their entire universe. The fact that they slept in the same bed, that they spoke a private language, that they cut off their mother and all other social contact, these were the actions of people building that closed system. And the most potent symbol of this system? The locked doors. The front door of the house was bolted from the inside to keep the world out. But the attic door? The attic door was also bolted from the inside. This is psychologically critical. They were not just locking the Lancelins out of their room, they were locking themselves in to their shared reality. The locked attic door was the physical manifestation of their folie à deux. Inside this sealed psychological container, with no fresh air, no outside perspective, Christine's paranoia began to fester. And this brings us to our second lens, the persecutory gaze. As we established, Madame Lancelin was an exacting employer. She was obsessed with cleanliness. She was the woman with the white gloves, constantly inspecting, constantly judging. To a healthy mind, this is an annoyance, an irritation. But to Christine's mind, which was already tilting into paranoia, this was not an irritation. It was an attack. The gaze of Madame Lancelin, her inspections, her corrections, her very presence, became the focal point of all their shared paranoid energy. She was the avatar of them. She was the living symbol of every person who had ever judged, exploited, or humiliated them. In their shared delusion, Madame Lancelin was not just an employer, she was the persecutor. And in a paranoid mind, there are only two options when dealing with a persecutor: you flee or you destroy. They had nowhere to flee. The attic was their entire world. And so, on February 2nd, when the broken iron led to another confrontation, another gaze of disappointment, the system snapped. The 2-hour frenzy was not murder. It was, in their minds, self-defense. It was an attempt to destroy the persecutor who, in their delusion, was trying to destroy them. This explains the rage. It explains the overkill. But it still does not explain the eyes. This is the most horrific part of the crime, but it is also the most psychologically significant, and it brings us to our third lens, the psychoanalytic symbol. The famous French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan wrote a seminal essay on the Pepin sisters. He argued that this was a paranoid crime, and he knew, as all psychoanalysts do, that in a paranoid crime, the violence is never random. It is deeply symbolic. They did not just attack Madame Lancelin and her daughter. They attacked the gaze. The enucleation of the eyes was a terrifyingly literal act. They were destroying the very source of their perceived persecution. They were blinding the eyes that had watched them, judged them, and, in their minds, psychologically oppressed them every day of their lives. This was not a random act of savagery. It was the specific, ritualistic, symbolic conclusion to their shared paranoid delusion. They were, in their minds, extinguishing the evil eye that had tormented them. This is the why of the crime, and the final, tragic proof of this folie à deux diagnosis is what happened after the trial. The sentence that Christine and Leah had feared most was not death or imprisonment, it was separation. And the court, in its wisdom, gave them exactly that. The closed system was broken open. The two minds that had merged into one were forcibly torn apart. The secondary partner, Leah, was sent to prison. Once she was removed from the influence of her primary sister, her psychosis began to fade. The delusion evaporated. She was, by all accounts, a model prisoner, quiet, remorseful, and seemingly normal. She served her 10-year sentence, was released, and went to live quietly with her mother, disappearing from history. The receiver, with no transmitter, simply returned to her default state. But the primary, Christine, was another story. Her sentence was commuted from death to life in prison, but she would not serve it. In prison, separated from Leah, Christine Pepin fell off a psychological cliff. The transmitter had no receiver. The delusion, which had been manageable when shared and contained, now had nowhere to go but inward. It consumed her. She was transferred to a mental asylum. She descended into a deep, inconsolable madness. She was racked with hallucinations. She would scream for her sister, convinced that Leah was being tortured in the next room. She refused to eat, methodically starving herself. Christine, the architect of the madness, could not survive without her partner. Leah, the follower, could not survive with her. In 1937, just a few years after the crime, Christine Papin died in the asylum from cachexia, a medical term for wasting away. She had, quite literally, died of starvation and a broken, isolated mind. This is the final, tragic proof of the folie à deux. The system could not survive separation. One half simply faded away, and the other half self-destructed. The case of the Papin sisters is not, in the end, a story about monsters. It is a story about pressure. It is a psychological tragedy about the immense, unseen gravity of generational trauma, class humiliation, and profound, suffocating isolation. It is a warning about the danger of the closed system. It shows what can happen when two damaged minds, cut off from the world, are left to build their own reality, a reality that, under enough pressure, can warp into a paranoid nightmare. The violence they committed was real, and it was horrific, but the forces that built the bomb were invisible. They were the silent violences of their childhood and the daily, quiet humiliation of the gaze. It's a case that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the very nature of responsibility. Where does madness begin, and where does evil end? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you see this as a crime of pure malice, or as the tragic, unavoidable implosion of two deeply unwell minds? It is a question that lingers long after the case files have been closed. But for now, it is time to let this story fade. The house on the Rue Bruyère is quiet once more. The attic room is empty. Welcome back. He was, by all accounts, a quiet man, a helpful neighbor, a lonely computer expert who lived in the massive 40-room house his mother had left him. But Armin Maiwes was haunted by a fantasy. It was a fantasy born of profound, agonizing loneliness, a fantasy of finding a brother, a companion, someone who would finally stay, someone who could never drive away and abandon him. And his solution, born in the isolation of that giant house, was a dark one. The only way to truly merge with someone, to possess them forever, was to make them a physical part of himself. Tonight, as the house settles around you, we are going to tell the story of Armin Maiwes. We will explore the psychological trauma that built this fantasy, and what happened when, in 2001, the internet delivered a man who wanted that fantasy to become his reality. Our story, however, does not begin with the fantasy. It begins with its discovery. In December of 2002, a university student in Austria was browsing the dark corners of the internet. He was scrolling through a forum, a place known for its extreme, taboo fantasies, when he saw an advertisement. The ad was new, but it was not the first of its kind. It was posted by a user known as Der Metzgermeister, the Master Butcher. The post was a search. It was looking for a young, well-built man for slaughter and consumption. The student, alarmed, sent an anonymous tip to the German Federal Police, the BKA. The BKA traced the IP address. It led them to a large, remote, and beautiful half-timbered farmhouse in the small village of Wüstefeld, near the town of Rothenburg. The property belonged to a 41-year-old computer technician, a man named Armin Maiwes. When the police cruisers pulled up the long drive, they were not prepared for a confrontation. The tip was bizarre, likely a hoax, but it had to be investigated. They knocked. Armin Maiwes himself answered the door. He was not what they expected. He was not a monster. He was mild-mannered, articulate, and calm. He invited them in. The house was enormous, a 40-room estate that had once been a manor. But the police officers immediately noted it was impeccably clean. It was orderly. There were no signs of a struggle, no smell of decay. This was not a chaotic scene. This was a place of order. The officers explained the reason for their visit, the internet posting. And Armin Maiwes did not deny it. He simply nodded. One of the officers asked the direct question, "Is there anyone here? Are you holding someone here?" Maiwes replied, "No, not anymore." A chill went through the officers. This was no hoax. "Where is he?" one of them asked. Maiwes led them, not to the basement, but to the kitchen, to a large chest-style deep freezer. He opened the lid. Inside, the officers were met with a scene of surreal, domestic horror. There were packages of frozen meat, dozens of them. They were sitting neatly alongside frozen pizzas and bags of garden vegetables. But these packages were different. They were wrapped in clear plastic, and they were meticulously, carefully labeled. Steak, roast, filet, sirloin. This was the seeding of our first psychological fact. This was not the work of a frenzied, chaotic killer. This was the work of a butcher, a planner, someone who treated this as a process. Mewes was immediately arrested. As they searched the house, they found other items. They found the Schlachtraum, the slaughter room he had built, complete with meat hooks and a cage. And they found a home video cassette. The tape, which has never been released to the public, was a 4-hour recording. It was the complete documentation of what had happened in this house 1 year prior. Mewes, now in custody, was ready to talk. In fact, he seemed relieved. He confessed to everything. He explained that the meat in the freezer belonged to a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin named Bernd Jürgen Brandis. And then he said the words that would paralyze the German legal system. He told them that Bernd Brandis had been a willing participant. He had not been a victim. He had been an applicant. To understand the meticulously labeled packages in that freezer, you cannot look at Armin Meiwes in 2002. You must look at him in 1961, the year he was born. You must look at him as a small 8-year-old boy standing and watching his father drive away. This is the central trauma. The why of Armin Meiwes begins here. He was born in Rothenburg, West Germany, the child of a marriage that was, by all accounts, deeply unhappy. His father, a police officer, was the third husband of his mother, Waltraud. She was 20 years older than his father, a woman described by everyone who knew her as domineering, controlling, and deeply possessive. The marriage fractured, as her previous ones had. When Armin was 8 years old, his father left. Mewes, in his later confessions, described this moment with a haunting clarity. He recalled standing there, crying, watching his father's car disappear down the long driveway. He watched him go, and his father never looked back. For a small child, this is not a separation. It is an erasure. It is the ultimate abandonment. And it planted a seed. A deep, agonizing psychological wound. The fear of being left. The terror of abandonment. With the father gone, Armin was left alone with Waltraud. She was now his entire world, and she, in turn, saw him as her entire possession. Waltraud moved herself and young Armin into the massive 40-room Wüstefeld estate. It was a beautiful, sprawling farmhouse, but it was also profoundly isolated, set back from the town, hidden by trees. It was here that Meiwes's profound loneliness began to crystallize. He had no real friends. He had no siblings. He had only his mother. A mother who reportedly smothered him, controlled his every move, and, in a strange psychological twist, would often call him Männchen, a girl's name. He was trapped in this giant, empty house, a fortress of solitude, with a woman who was, in essence, his warden. And so, like many lonely children, Armin created a friend. He invented an imaginary brother. He called this brother Frankie. Frankie was everything Armin was not. He was strong, confident, and popular. But most importantly, Frankie was a companion. Frankie was the brother who would never leave. This fantasy, this seeding of his psychological obsession, was his only comfort. As he grew through adolescence, this fantasy of Frankie began to change. It started to merge with his budding sexuality. The desire for a companion, a brother, became a desire for possession. He didn't just want a friend to be with him. He wanted a friend to be part of him. This is where the pathological solution began to form in his mind. He read fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel and became obsessed, not with the horror, but with the idea. He read adventure stories like Robinson Crusoe and fantasized about having a companion, a Friday, whom he could control and consume. He began to believe, in the warped logic of his isolated mind, that the only true way to merge with another person, the only way to possess them so completely that they could never, ever abandon him, the only way to ensure they would never drive away without looking back, was to literally, physically consume them, to eat them. This fantasy became his entire internal world. It was his comfort, his secret, his only desire. For decades, however, it remained just that, a fantasy. Outwardly, Armin Maiwes was a model citizen. He was polite, intelligent, and helpful. He joined the German army and served for 12 years, rising to the rank of staff sergeant. His superiors called him reliable and a good comrade. He was, in essence, the perfect mask. But behind the mask, the fantasy was waiting. He eventually left the army and returned home to the giant farmhouse, to Vol10. His mother was older now, and she became ill, and Armin, the dutiful son, became her full-time caregiver. For years he tended to her, trapped in the same house, in the same dynamic of control and possession that had defined his childhood. Then, in 1999, the detonator event happened. Waltraud died. Suddenly, at the age of nearly 40, Armin Maiwes was, for the first time in his entire life, alone. And he was free. The house, that 40-room fortress of his isolation, was now his. The one person who had controlled him was gone. The loneliness, once managed, now became absolute. The emptiness of the house was a deafening roar. And the fantasy of Frankie, the fantasy of merging, the fantasy of consumption, now had the space to become a plan. He logged onto his computer. The internet was still a new, wild frontier. It was a place where any desire, no matter how dark, could find a community. He found the forums, places like the Cannibal Cafe, and he realized he was not the only one. He created his username, Der Metzgermeister, the Master Butcher, and he posted his advertisement. He was no longer just dreaming of a companion, he was hunting for one. He was looking for someone who wanted to be Frankie. He was the lock, and he was now actively searching for the key. Armin Maiwes was the lock, a complex psychological mechanism forged by abandonment and loneliness. His advertisements, posted in the dark, were a question. And on March 9, 2001, that question was answered. The key arrived. The man who stepped off the train in Rottenburg was Bernd Jürgen Brandes's. To understand what happened next, it is crucial to understand this. Bernd Brandes's was not a victim in the conventional sense. He was not hunted. He was not coerced. He was the other half of the equation. He was the symmetrical fantasy. If Maiwes was a psychological predator driven by a need to merge, Brandes was a psychological prey driven by an equally powerful need to be annihilated. Outwardly, Bernd Brandes, age 43, was a successful man. He was a lead engineer, a manager at Siemens, a respected professional living in Berlin. He was, by all measures, a man of intellect and standing. But like Armin Maiwes, Brandes was also living behind a mask. And beneath his mask was a trauma that perfectly mirrored the one in Rothenburg. Where Maiwes' trauma came from abandonment, Brandes' trauma came from a violent loss. When Bernd Brandes was a small child, His mother committed suicide. This event, the inexplicable, violent self-erasure of his primary caregiver, created a psychological wound that, for Brandis, never healed. It is a trauma that defies logic, a black hole of grief and confusion. And just as Maiwes' mind had created a pathological fantasy to solve his loneliness, Brandis' mind had created one to solve his trauma. His fantasy was annihilation. His psychological obsession, which he had harbored for decades, was not just to die, but to be unmade, to be completely consumed, to have his physical body erased from the world, just as his mother had been. It was a profound, psychosexual desire to be destroyed. We know this, not from speculation, but from evidence. During the trial, the prosecution had to grapple with this uncomfortable fact. This was not a random man Maiwes had lured. This was an active, eager participant. Witnesses were brought forward, former partners of Brandis. They testified, one after another, that this was his obsession. They told the court that Brandis had always talked about it. He had fantasized, graphically, about being mutilated. One former lover testified that Brandis had offered him thousands of Deutschmarks to bite off his penis. The man refused, thinking it was a disturbing but ultimately harmless fantasy. He was wrong. Burned Brandis was searching just as actively as Armin Maiwes was, and when he saw the advertisement from Der Metzgermeister, he knew he had found his partner. He had found the one person in the world who needed not just to kill, but to consume. This was not an impulse trip. This was the end of his search. The evidence for this is in Brandis's own actions in the days leading up to March 9th. They are not the actions of a victim being lured. They are the actions of a man preparing for his own deliberate end. First, he cleared his professional life. He took a formal leave of absence from his high-level job at Siemens. Second, he cleared his financial life. He sold his car. He systematically erased the hard drives on his computers. And finally, he prepared his will. In a calm, rational state of mind, Burned Brandis wrote out his last will and testament. He did not, as a coerced victim might, leave his assets to his killer in a bid for his life. Instead, he left all his property and money to his other friends and his former partner. He was, in essence, closing his accounts. He was methodically shutting down the life he had built, because, in his mind, he was about to achieve the ultimate bliss he had been fantasizing about for 30 years. When he boarded the train from Berlin to Rodenburg, he was not a lamb going to the slaughter. He was the key, traveling to meet its lock. We have the lock, Armin Maiwes, and the key, Burned Brandis. We have 2 decades of symmetrical, pathological fantasy. On March 9th, 2001, in the Rotenburg farmhouse, those 2 fantasies finally converged in the real world. The 4-hour videotape that Maiwes recorded, which police seized from his home, documents this convergence. It is the primary evidence. The tape begins not with violence, but with conversation. Maiwes picked Brandis up from the train station. They drove back to the massive, isolated farmhouse. And for a short time, they just talked. They confirmed what they had discussed online. This was the final check. Was this real? Was this what both men wanted? It was. Brandis was, by all accounts, calm, rational, and resolute. This was his fantasy, just as much as it was Maiwes's. They moved to the Schlachtraum, the slaughter room that Maiwes had prepared. And there they formalized the pact. On camera, Brandis confirmed his identity. He confirmed, unequivocally, that he was there of his own free will, and that he consented to what was about to happen. This was the moment the legal system would later be unable to process. This was not murder. It was an appointment. To prepare, Brandis swallowed a heavy dose of 20 sleeping pills, washed down with a large bottle of schnapps. This was, in theory, to make the process less painful, to dull his senses. Then, Brandis, still conscious, made the first request. He asked Maiwes to cut off his penis. This was the specific, repeated fantasy Brandis had held for years, the one he had offered to pay others to perform. Maiwes, using a kitchen knife, complied. This is the moment the fantasy collided, brutally, with reality. The act was clumsy, and it was painful. Maiwes, der Metzgermeister, was not a surgeon. Maiwes then took the severed part to the kitchen, intending to fulfill the second part of Brandis's fantasy, that they would consume it together. He fried it in a pan with salt, pepper, garlic, and a piece of Brandis's own body fat. But reality intervened again. The flesh was, as Maiwes later described, too tough to be eaten. The grotesque ceremony was a failure. Meanwhile, Brandis was bleeding profusely. Maiwes, ever the caregiver, drew a hot bath for him. Brandis lay in the bathtub for hours, slowly, agonizingly bleeding out. The video reportedly shows Maiwes spending this time with him, reading to him from a Star Trek novel, talking to him, waiting. The sleeping pills, the alcohol, and the catastrophic blood loss were all taking their toll. Burned Brandis was slipping into shock and then into unconsciousness. His fantasy, his desire for annihilation, was being realized. After nearly 10 hours, Brandis was unconscious, his life fading. The agreement was now complete. Maiwes had fulfilled his partner's desire, and now it was time to fulfill his own. Maiwes carried Brandis from the tub to the slaughter room. Brandis was, at this point, either dead or dying. To end it, Maiwes took the knife and kissed him. This is the final, crucial psychological detail. He kissed him on the lips. In the warped, pathological mind of Armin Maiwes, this was not an act of violence. It was an act of love. It was the ultimate, twisted expression of his lifelong fantasy. He was finally merging with Frankie. He was finally possessing the brother who would never leave him, the one who would never drive away without looking back. After the kiss, he cut Brandis's throat. The event was over. The key had been used. The lock had been closed. The event was over, but the process had just begun. For Armin Maiwes, the kiss and the final cut were not the end. They were the beginning of the merge. In the days that followed, he brought his new companion to the slaughter room. He was not a frenzied killer. He was, in his mind, der Metzgermeister. He was a professional. He spent days meticulously butchering the body of Bernd Brandes. He was, by his own account, precise. He hung the body on meat hooks, and with a clinical, practiced skill, he disassembled it. And this brings us back to the seeding from Hoi 1, the scene in the freezer. The reason the packages were so neatly labeled. The reason they were stored with such care alongside his other food is that this was not evidence to him. It was not the grotesque refuse of a murder. It was food. It was his companion. Over the next 10 months, Armin Maiwes lived out the final stage of his fantasy. Several times a week, he would go to the freezer. He would select a cut, and he would prepare a meal. But this too was a ritual. He did not, as he said, gobble it down. He treated it with a strange reverence. He would set the table. He used his mother's best china, the Gute Porzellan. He lit candles. He poured a glass of good wine, often a Cabernet Sauvignon. And he would sit, alone in his massive 40-room house, and have dinner with Bernd. He would, he claimed, talk to him. He was finally having the quiet, domestic life with the brother who would never leave. He was absorbing Brandis, making Brandis a part of his own cellular structure. The merge was, in his mind, complete. He consumed over 20 kilograms, nearly 45 pounds of the flesh. He was, by his own admission, very happy during this time. The profound, agonizing loneliness that had defined his entire life was finally gone. This ritual might have continued until Brandis was gone, but Mivas's core psychology, the lock, had not changed. The fantasy was the true drive. And so, even as he was consuming Brandis, he went back online. He was looking for his next applicant. It was this act, this need to repeat the fantasy, that led to his arrest. And his arrest plunged the German legal system into a paradox. In 2004, Armin Meiwes went on trial. The courtroom was a media circus. But the judge and prosecutors faced a problem that no one had ever encountered. The victim had, on video, consented. He had begged for it. And, crucially, the German legal code, written in the 19th century, had no law against cannibalism. This was the central legal question. How do you punish a man for a crime that doesn't exist? And how do you prosecute a murder where the victim was a willing, eager participant? Meiwes's defense argued that this was not murder. It was, at worst, killing on request. This is a crime in Germany, similar to illegal euthanasia, and it carries a maximum sentence of only 5 years. The prosecution struggled. Meiwes was, surprisingly, a good witness for himself. He was intelligent, articulate, and calm. He explained his psychology. He explained his loneliness. He explained Bernd Brandis's own fantasy. The court was convinced. In that first trial, the court found that Brandis was, in fact, a willing participant. They could not charge Meiwes with mord, murder for base motives like sexual pleasure. Armin Meiwes was found guilty only of Totschlag, or manslaughter. He was sentenced to just 8.5 years in prison. The public was outraged. The legal system had been paralyzed by a 19th century fantasy. The prosecutors immediately appealed. In 2006, Meiwes was tried again. This time, the prosecution had a new strategy. They brought in psychologists. They argued that even if Brandis was willing, he was not of sound mind. The combination of 20 sleeping pills, a bottle of schnapps, and catastrophic blood loss meant that by the time Meiwes delivered the final kiss and cut, Brandis was no longer legally able to consent. He was, at that point, just a helpless man. And this time, the prosecution argued that Meiwes did have a base motive: sexual gratification. Not in the conventional sense, but in the psychological sense. The merge was his gratification. This time, the court agreed. Armin Meiwes was found guilty of mord, murder for base motives. The sentence was the maximum allowed: life in prison. What does a 16-year-old girl living in poverty, sleeping on a mattress on the floor next to her father's empty liquor bottles, do when she is diagnosed with severe depression and suicidal ideation, and her father refuses to let her be hospitalized? What does she do when, just weeks later, that same father hands her a rifle for Christmas? On January 29, 1979, Brenda Spencer answered that question. The world remembers her for a flippant, cold-blooded remark about not liking Mondays. But tonight, as you get comfortable, we are going to ignore that media myth. We are going to explore the delayed truth, the story that was buried for decades. A story not of senseless evil, but of a desperate, failed attempt at suicide by cop. The morning of Monday, January 29, 1979, began like any other in the San Carlos neighborhood of San Diego. The air was cool. The sun was just beginning to burn off the morning haze. Across the street from the Spencer house, the bell was about to ring at Grover Cleveland Elementary School. Children, bundled in jackets, were arriving. They were laughing, trading stories, dragging their backpacks. A few were lined up, waiting patiently by the front gate. It was a perfect, ordinary scene. The school's principal, Burton Ragg, age 53, was at the gate greeting the students. He was a beloved figure, a kind man known for his warmth. At approximately 8:50 a.m., the first sound cut through the morning air. Crack. It was a sharp, percussive sound. Many children, and even some of the adults, dismissed it. It sounded like a firecracker, perhaps a backfiring car. Then, a second crack. A 9-year-old boy, Cam Miller, felt a sharp sting in his back and fell to the ground. The children around him scattered, confused, not yet understanding. Then the sounds came faster. Crack, crack, crack. A window shattered in the school's cafeteria. A piece of concrete near the gate exploded into dust. This was not a firecracker. This was a rifle. From a window in the house across the street, a sniper was methodically firing into the playground. Burton Ragg, the principal, saw the children falling. He didn't run for cover. He ran toward the children, yelling for them to get down, to get inside. As he was shielding a student, a .22 caliber bullet tore through his chest. He collapsed. Another adult, the school custodian Mike Suchar, age 56, was nearby. He saw Ragg fall. He too made a choice. He ran from his place of safety in a desperate attempt to drag his friend and principal to cover. A single shot rang out, and Mike Suchar fell beside him. 9-year-old Christy Buell was hit. Charles Mathewson, age 9, was hit. Monica Selvig, 9, was hit. In total, 8 children were wounded. One police officer who arrived on the scene would be shot in the neck, and 2 men, Burton Ragg and Mike Suchar, lay dying, murdered for their heroism. The source of the chaos? A 16-year-old girl sitting comfortably in her bedroom window, firing the .22 caliber rifle her father had just given her for Christmas. Her name was Brenda Ann Spencer. As police cars screeched to a halt, creating a blockade, the neighborhood descended into a panic. The rifle continued to fire, pinning down officers and paramedics. In the midst of this chaos, a reporter for the San Diego Evening Tribune, Gus Stevens, had an idea. He was at his office, listening to the police scanner. He knew the address of the house. On a desperate long shot, he began to call random phone numbers in the immediate vicinity. He dialed the number for the Spencer house. He expected a terrified neighbor to answer. He did not expect the sniper herself to pick up the phone. A young, calm, female voice answered. Stevens, stunned, identified himself. He asked who was firing. "It was me," the voice said. Stevens, trying to keep her on the line, asked the most important question. The question the entire world would soon be asking. Why? There was a pause, and then the 16-year-old girl, in a voice described by Stevens as flippant and cold, gave the answer that would define her and the crime for decades. This was the seeding of the myth. This was the tip of the iceberg. She said, "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." Stevens, incredulous, pushed her. "What do you mean you don't like Mondays?" She continued, her voice detached. "I was just doing it for fun. I just don't like Mondays. I just started shooting." She told the reporter she had shot at the children because they were an easy target. She told him she was going to come out shooting. That quote, "I don't like Mondays," was a media sensation. It was gasoline on a fire. It hit the wire services before the siege was even over. Within hours, it was a global headline. It was the perfect, terrifying soundbite. It painted a picture of a new kind of evil, nihilistic, bored, and senseless. Brenda Spencer, in that single flippant remark, had just become the international poster child for meaningless violence. While the world was latching on to the Monday's quote, the police on the scene were dealing with a 6-hour, high-stakes siege. The sniper was a 16-year-old girl, confirmed to be Brenda Spencer, and she was barricaded inside the house directly across the street, a small, dilapidated rental property. The house itself was the first piece of the puzzle. It was not a middle-class home. Brenda and her father, Wallace Spencer, lived in what was described as abject poverty. The house was a chaotic mess. Neighbors and, later, investigators described a home where the two of them slept together on a single, soiled mattress laid out on the living room floor. The room was reportedly littered with empty beer and liquor bottles. This was not a stable environment. This was a home of profound dysfunction and neglect. Brenda, who had been a gifted student in her early years, had become a withdrawn, sullen, and often truant teenager. She was known as a loner who preferred the company of animals and who had recently begun telling friends that she wanted to do something big so she could be on TV. Police negotiators, now surrounding the house, were dealing with this volatile 16-year-old personality, and she was heavily armed. The weapon she was using was a Ruger 1022 semi-automatic rifle fitted with a telescopic sight. This was not a weapon she had stolen. It had been a Christmas present just a few weeks prior from her father, Wallace. This is the seeding of our second and perhaps most critical psychological fact. Brenda, in her interviews, would later make a chilling statement that summed up the dysfunction of that gift. She said, "I asked for a radio, and he gave me a rifle." Wallace Spencer, who lived in that house with his daughter, who saw her truancy, her withdrawal, and her growing instability, had decided that the appropriate gift for his 16-year-old was a deadly weapon, complete with 500 rounds of ammunition. Back at the siege, the hours dragged on. Brenda was erratic. She continued to fire the rifle periodically, forcing police to keep their distance. Officer Robert Robb, the first officer on the scene, was hit by a bullet that pierced his neck, the round miraculously missing his carotid artery by millimeters. He would survive, but he was the 9th victim. Inside the house, Brenda was calm, almost bored. She spoke with negotiators. She spoke again with the press. She even, at one point, had a long, casual conversation with a local radio DJ who had called the house, playing him songs over the phone. The entire event was, for her, a surreal performance. The siege finally broke, not with a tactical assault, but with a bizarre negotiation. After nearly 7 hours, Brenda was getting hungry. A police negotiator, sensing an opening, made an offer. If she put down the rifle and came out peacefully, they would buy her a meal from Burger King. Brenda considered it, and then she agreed. The 16-year-old girl who had just murdered 2 men and shot 9 other people, the girl who told the world she did it because she didn't like Mondays, was lured out of her fortress by the promise of a hamburger. She walked out of the house unarmed and was arrested. The rifle was found inside, pointed out the window, 36 spent shell casings littering the floor around it. The what was over. The siege had ended. The immediate context was clear. A poor, troubled girl, a new rifle, and a flippant, chilling motive. The legal proceedings that followed were swift, almost a formality. Brenda Spencer, now in custody, was separated from the rifle and the Burger King. The performance was over. She confessed immediately. She recounted the morning's events with the same detached, cold quality she had displayed on the phone. There was no trial by jury. Brenda's defense attorneys, facing a mountain of evidence, 36 shell casings, dozens of eyewitnesses, and the most inflammatory motive in modern history, knew that a jury trial was unwinnable. The Mondays quote, which had already made her a global pariah, would guarantee a first-degree murder conviction and potentially, given the public outrage, the death penalty. Their only viable strategy was to avoid a trial altogether. They advised Brenda to plead guilty. On April 1, 1980, Brenda Spencer, now 17, stood before a judge. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon. Because she was a minor, she was ineligible for the death penalty. But the judge, citing the cold-blooded nature of the attack, showed no leniency. She was sentenced to the maximum allowed by law, 2 concurrent terms of 25 years to life in prison. For the public, for the media, and for the legal system of 1980, the case was closed. The what had been punished. The why had been established, as far as they were concerned. A bored, nihilistic teenager didn't like Mondays, so she shot up a school. It was a simple, terrifying, and satisfyingly uncomplicated narrative. But it was, in almost every way, wrong. The trial was over, but the truth had not yet been spoken. The tip of the iceberg had been tried and convicted. But the iceberg mass, the massive, hidden psychological trauma beneath the surface, had not even been discovered. That truth would remain buried in silence for another 20 years. The case was closed, but the story was not over. That narrative, the simple, clean story of a girl who didn't like Mondays, was the tip of the iceberg. It was a media myth, convenient and terrifying. But the iceberg mass, the vast, dark, psychological truth beneath the surface, was far more tragic. And that truth only began to emerge decades later, not in interviews, but in the cold, sterile transcripts of parole board hearings. To understand what really happened on January 29, 1979, we must first ignore Brenda's famous quote. We must set it aside and look at the facts that the world ignored. This brings us to our first psychological lens, the ignored red flag. The shooting happened in January 1979. We must go back 1 month to December 1978. Brenda, at that time, was already on probation for minor offenses like theft. She was known to be a problem child. A probation officer, concerned about her escalating truancy and bizarre behavior, ordered a full psychiatric evaluation. Brenda was sent to a facility for troubled youth. The doctors who evaluated her did not find a bored or flippant teenager. They found a 16-year-old girl in a state of profound crisis. The official diagnosis, written in her file just weeks before the shooting, was major clinical depression. The psychiatrist noted that she was deeply withdrawn, expressed feelings of hopelessness, and was, in their professional opinion, suicidal. The recommendation was not a suggestion. It was an urgent warning. The doctors formally recommended that Brenda Spencer be immediately hospitalized in a mental institution for her own safety. This was the system working. The red flag was raised, the alarm was pulled. But the system had a failsafe. That failed. Because she was a minor, the hospitalization required a parent's signature. The doctors presented their findings to her father, Wallace Spencer. They explained the diagnosis. They explained the suicide risk. They explained the urgent need for inpatient treatment. And Wallace Spencer refused. He refused to sign the papers. He reportedly told the staff that he could handle her himself. He took his daughter out of the facility and brought her back to the house, back to the mattress on the floor, back to the empty liquor bottles. This is the thuhuak, harvest, of that second critical seed. Just a few days later, it was Christmas. Brenda asked for a clock radio. Wallace, the man who had just been told unequivocally that his daughter was severely depressed and suicidal, went to a gun store. and he purchased a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, a telescopic sight, and 500 rounds of ammunition. The Mondays, quote, was a lie. This was the why. This was the true, terrifying motive. The shooting was not an act of boredom. It was an act of profound, untreated, and then weaponized mental illness. But the why goes even deeper. Decades passed. Brenda Spencer became a middle-aged woman in a prison cell. This brings us to our second lens, the delayed truth of abuse. At her parole hearing in 2001, a 40-year-old Brenda Spencer finally revealed why she was so depressed. She told the parole board for the first time a story she had been unable, or perhaps too terrified, to tell in 1979, while her father was her only guardian. She alleged that, beginning when she was 11 years old, her father, Wallace Spencer, had subjected her to years of systematic, physical, and sexual abuse. She described a life of beatings and repeated violations. Suddenly, the house on the living room floor, the single mattress, the poverty, and the alcohol shifts from a picture of simple neglect to a portrait of something far more sinister. The parole board, it should be said, was skeptical of this. Why, they asked, was she only saying this now? Was it just a desperate plea for sympathy? A delayed truth used to get out of prison? Brenda's response was simple. Who was I supposed to tell? He was my father. He was all I had. And this leads to our third lens, self-medication. Brenda also admitted at that hearing that her detached and flippant behavior had a chemical component. She stated that at the time of the shooting, she was self-medicating to cope with the depression and the abuse. She claimed to have been heavily under the influence of both alcohol and PCP, or angel dust, a powerful hallucinogen known to cause dissociation, aggression, and a complete detachment from reality. Now, let's thuwak, harvest that first seed. Let's look at that Mondays quote again. I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day. Was this the cold, flippant remark of a nihilistic monster? Or was it the dissociated rambling of a 16-year-old girl high on PCP, suffering from severe, untreated depression and reeling from years of alleged sexual abuse? Was her detachment a sign of evil? Or was it a clinical symptom of dissociation, a mind that had checked out to survive? The delayed truth reframes everything, and it leads us to the final and most recent psychological lens, the one that perhaps makes the most sense of all. This is the motive she holds to today in her most recent 2022 parole hearing. She stated that the Mondays, quote, was a lie, something she doesn't even remember saying. She claims the story about abuse and drugs is true, but that it wasn't the motive. The motive, she now claims, was suicide by cop. Let's decode this. She was 16. She was suicidal. She had been, in her words, failed by the system. Her father, her only guardian, had not only refused her treatment, but had given her a gun. In her mind, there was no way out. She wanted to die. But she couldn't or wouldn't do it herself. So she formulated a new plan, a plan to force the world's hand. She believed that if she did something so horrific, so monstrous, the police would be forced to respond. They would come, and they would kill her. The shooting was never about the children. The children were just, in her cold 1979 logic, an easy target. They were the bait. The target was herself. The two men who died, Burton Ragg and Mike Suchar, were not just victims of her rage. They were, in this tragic psychological framework, collateral damage in her own twisted, desperate, and failed suicide attempt. The legend of Brenda Spencer is a chilling, simple story about a girl who didn't like Mondays. But the truth of Brenda Spencer is a far more complex, far more tragic story about a system and a father who failed a child. It is a story about the delayed truth. It shows us that the why of a crime, especially one committed by a traumatized adolescent, is often not what is said in the heat of the moment. The real why is often buried under layers of pain, dissociation, and fear, only to emerge decades later. The girl who told the world she was bored was in fact severely depressed. The girl who acted flippant was, by her own account, dissociated on hallucinogens. And the girl who seemed to be committing a senseless act of evil may in fact have been committing a desperate, failed act of suicide. 2 men are dead, and 9 other lives were shattered, not because of a day of the week, but because a profound mental health crisis was met not with a hospital, but with a rifle. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Does the delayed truth of the abuse and the suicide by cop motive change how you see this case? Or was the 1979 narrative, the story of senseless evil, the correct one all along? It is a story that reminds us that the why is almost never as simple as the what. But for now, the case is closed. The parole board has denied Brenda Spencer's release multiple times, most recently in 2022. She remains in prison. In 1973, when police arrested Herbert Mullen for a string of brutal, chaotic murders, he confessed. And then he asked them a question. He asked if they had checked the seismograph. He asked if they had noticed that, after each of his murders, the earthquakes had stopped. Herbert Mullen was not a killer in his own mind. He was a hero. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was receiving telepathic commands to offer human sacrifices in order to save California from a catastrophic earthquake. Tonight, as you close your eyes, we are entering the delusional world of a paranoid schizophrenic. But before we enter his mind, we must see what the police saw. We must land in Santa Cruz, California, in the fall of 1972. It was a paradise that was about to become a portrait of chaos. For 4 months, the city and its surrounding areas were gripped by a terror that made no sense. It was a storm of violence without a pattern, a spree that seemed to have no logic. It began on October 13, 1972. Lawrence Whitey White, a 55-year-old homeless man, was walking down a quiet road. He was found the next day, his head caved in. The weapon, discarded nearby, was a baseball bat. It was a brutal, personal, and messy killing, a crime of rage. But then, just 11 days later, the pattern immediately broke. Mary Guilfoyle, a 24-year-old student, was late for an interview. She was last seen hitchhiking. Her body was found later, but not in one piece. She had been stabbed, and then, in a grim, ritualistic fashion, she had been dissected. Her body was found in pieces, discarded on a hillside. The police were now panicked. They had 2 murders in 2 weeks with 2 completely different methods, a baseball bat and a knife used for dissection. Then, silence for a week. On November 2nd, the killer struck again, this time in the nearby town of Los Gatos. Father Henry Tomei, a 64-year-old Catholic priest, was in his church in the confessional. It was a place of sanctuary. A man entered the confessional, not to confess, but to kill. He stabbed Father Tomei, the blade plunging deep, and fled, leaving the priest to bleed to death in the house of God. A bat, a dissection knife, a dagger in a church. The police were paralyzed. What kind of killer were they hunting? A vagrant hater? A sexual sadist? An anti-religious fanatic? And then, for 2 months, nothing. The trail went cold. The city held its breath, hoping the nightmare was over. It was not. On January 25, 1973, The killer erupted again, this time with a new weapon, a gun. He went to the former home of an old high school friend, James Gianera. A new resident, Kathy Francis, answered the door. The killer shot her. He shot her 9-year-old son, David. He shot her 4-year-old son, Damon. He then went to James Gianera's new address and shot him and his wife. 5 people, in one day, with a firearm. Just 12 days later, February 6th, 4 teenage boys, all aged around 18, were camping illegally in a state park. The killer approached them, possibly pretending to be a park ranger. He told them to leave. They, reportedly, refused. He pulled out his gun and executed all 4 of them. The Santa Cruz police were now in a state of total, absolute confusion. This was the seeding of the chaos. This was Hat Keyed 1. They were hunting a single man, a super killer, who was, somehow, a disorganized, rage-filled, bat-wielding killer, a cold, calculating, organized, knife-wielding dissector, and a detached, multi-victim, firearm-using executioner. He killed men, women, priests, and children. He killed the homeless and the middle class. He killed with personal rage and with cold detachment. It was impossible. This killer could not exist. To understand the chaos of 1973, we must rewind the clock to 1965. The man the police were hunting was not a born monster. He was, in fact, the exact opposite. Herbert Mullen was born on April 18, 1947. This is the seeding of our second psychological fact, his birth date, April 18th. A detail that, to a healthy mind, is insignificant, but to a fractured one can become a prophecy. He was raised in the Santa Cruz Mountains, in a small town called Felton. His father, a World War II veteran, was a strict disciplinarian. But young Herbert was, by all accounts, a model son. He was popular, he was handsome, he was athletic, he was intelligent. He was the boy every parent wanted. In 1965, as a senior at San Lorenzo Valley High School, his classmates voted him most likely to succeed. He was the golden boy. He had his entire life ahead of him, a future bright with promise. And then, 1 month after graduation, that future was annihilated. The crack, the trigger that broke Herbert Mullen's mind was a single tragic event. His best friend, his closest confidant, a boy named Dean Richardson, was killed in a horrific, high-speed car crash. Mullen was devastated. But this was not simple grief. This was a psychological shattering. He became obsessed. He built, in his bedroom, a series of shrines to his dead friend. He collected photographs, lit candles, and would reportedly sit and stare at them for hours, as if in a trance. His personality, once so bright and outgoing, turned inward. He became morose, quiet, and deeply strange. And, like many young men in the late 1960s California, he began to self-medicate desperately. He dove headfirst into heavy drug use, particularly LSD and marijuana. For a mind already fractured by grief, these hallucinogens were not a comfort. They were an accelerant. They were gasoline poured onto the smoldering fire of his underlying and still undiagnosed mental illness. The mental breakdown began in earnest. His family watched, horrified, as their golden boy disappeared. He began talking about reincarnation. He developed an obsession with religion, but it was a fractured, personalized religion. He started to hear voices. In 1969, his behavior became too erratic to ignore. His family, desperate, had him committed for the first time to the Mendocino State Hospital. This is where the story turns from a personal tragedy to a systemic one. The doctors at Mendocino were not confused. They knew what they were seeing. They gave Herbert Mullen a clear, definitive diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is not a split personality. It is a profound break from reality. It is a disorder characterized by auditory hallucinations, hearing voices, delusions, believing in a false, often persecutory reality, and disorganized thinking. Mullen was, in clinical terms, floridly psychotic. But this was the late 1960s and early 1970s, the era of deinstitutionalization. The prevailing wisdom at the time was that long-term hospitalization was cruel. The new policy was to stabilize patients with medication and then release them. So, after a short stay, Herbert Mullen was released. He would, over the next 4 years, be in and out of 5 different mental hospitals. The pattern was always the same. He would be committed by his family. He would be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He would be stabilized on antipsychotic drugs. And then, because he was deemed not a danger to himself or others, he would be released. But once released, Mullen, like many schizophrenics, would stop taking his medication. He didn't believe he was sick. He believed the medication was the problem. He believed it was poison that was blocking the important messages he was receiving. He was a walking psychological time bomb, and the system kept letting him go. He tried to join the Marines, but was rejected due to his mental health record. He tried to become a priest. He drifted. Finally, in early 1972, he returned to Santa Cruz to live with his aging parents. He was 25 years old, unmedicated, and his psychosis was blooming. He was, now, in his own mind, a prophet. He was receiving messages, telepathic commands, and he believed with every fiber of his being that his father was sending them. He would sit in his room listening, as his father's voice, a voice that was only in his head, gave him a new, terrifying purpose. A purpose that would, he believed, save the entire state of California. The Santa Cruz police were right about one thing. The killer they were hunting was impossible. The super killer, the man who used bats, knives, and guns, who killed men, women, and children, who was both organized and disorganized, did not exist. The police, the press, and the terrified public did not know the most terrifying fact of all. They were not hunting one serial killer. They were hunting 2. This is our B-plot. This is the psychological counterweight. At the exact same time that Herbert Mullen was committing his disorganized psychotic spree, another, very different and far more famous killer was also stalking the roads of Santa Cruz. His name was Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. Kemper was Mullen's dark opposite. Where Mullen was 5'9", Kemper was a 6'9" giant. Where Mullen was disorganized and psychotic, Kemper was a genius with an IQ of 145 and was highly organized, charming, and psychopathic. Where Mullen killed everyone his delusion pointed to, Kemper had a very specific type: young, female college students, or co-eds. The police were trying to merge 2 different puzzles into one. They were trying to find a link between Kemper's victims, the murdered co-eds, and Mullen's victims, the priest, the homeless man, the family. This is the Thuhuac harvest of our first seed. The chaos that defined Hoi Mot was the chaos of 2 separate, horrifying stories overlapping. While the police were chasing this phantom super killer, the end for Herbert Mullen came not from brilliant detective work, but from a simple, lucky break. On the morning of February 13, 1973, Mullen was driving his car. He was, once again, following the voices. He saw a 72-year-old man, Fred Perez, outside his home doing yard work. It was a random, tragic encounter. Mullen, believing he needed another sacrifice to hold off the earthquake, pulled out his .22 rifle, shot Mr. Perez, killing him instantly, and drove away. It was his 13th and final murder. What Mullen didn't know was that he had been seen. A neighbor of Mr. Perez, a woman named Joan Stuller, was looking out her window at the exact moment of the shooting. She was a vigilant neighbor, and she did what no one else had been able to do. She saw the car, she saw the driver, and, crucially, she got the license plate number. She immediately called the police. Minutes later, an all-points bulletin was out for Mullen's vehicle. He was pulled over by a patrolman. The murder weapon, the .22 rifle, was still in the car. Herbert Mullen was arrested without a fight. The police were jubilant. They had him. They had their super killer. They believed in that moment that the nightmare of Santa Cruz was finally over. They were wrong. They had caught a killer, but they had not caught the co-ed killer. As Mullen sat in his cell, the murders of young women continued. The police, stunned, were forced to realize the impossible truth. They had two monsters in their town, not one. But that is Edmund Kemper's story. For us, the arrest of Herbert Mullen is the pivot. The what was over. The legal case was closed. But the why, the real, terrifying, psychological why, was just about to be revealed. Herbert Mullen was in custody. The what was solved. But when detectives sat down to interview him, they were not prepared for the why. Mullen was not silent. He was not remorseful. He was eager. He confessed immediately to all 13 murders. And then he looked at the detectives, confused by their condemnation, and explained his motive. He told them he had saved California. He told them that because of his sacrifices, he had successfully prevented a catastrophic earthquake that would have killed thousands. He asked them, with genuine sincerity, to check the seismographs. He was, in his own mind, a hero. The detectives were not interviewing a criminal. They were interviewing a man whose mind was completely, tragically broken. This brings us to our why hook, our central psychological lens, paranoid schizophrenia. The acts of Herbert Mullen were not acts of evil in the way we understand it. They were not driven by greed or lust or revenge. They were the tragic, inevitable result of a diseased brain, a brain that had created its own terrifying, logical, and internally consistent reality. To understand his spree, you must understand his delusion. It began with the Thuhak harvest of our second seed, his birthday. Mullen was born on April 18th. To a healthy mind, this is a date. But to Mullen's paranoid schizophrenic mind, a mind searching for patterns, this was a prophecy. April 18th was the anniversary of the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake. In his fractured logic, this was proof. This was a sign from God. He was not just a man, he was a chosen instrument. He had been selected for a divine purpose. His purpose, he believed, was to prevent the next great earthquake, which he believed was imminent. But how? This is where the auditory and telepathic hallucinations began. He believed he was receiving commands. He claimed these commands came telepathically from his own father, from within the house. He believed his father's voice was telling him that the only way to appease the violent, shifting earth was with blood. He had to make human sacrifices. And this is the Tuhaik harvest of our first seed. This is the logic behind the seemingly chaotic spree. The spree was not random, it was his delusion choosing the sacrifices. Lawrence White, the homeless man, Natnyen Mot, Mullen claimed he looked at him and telepathically recognized him as the biblical figure Jonah, who had also volunteered to be sacrificed. Father Tomei, the priest, Natnyen Ba, Mullen went into the confessional.
In his mind, the priest, by being in that holy place, was offering himself as a perfect, willing sacrifice. James Genera, the old friend? He had sold Mullen drugs in high school, which Mullen, incorrectly, blamed for his psychosis. Genera was a sinner whose sacrifice was necessary. The 4 teenage boys camping, Nanyen Taten? In Mullen's mind, they were polluting the sacred forest. They were disrespecting the earth. And, in his logic, their disrespect was calling the earthquake. By killing them, he was stopping their call. Every murder had, in his mind, a divine, logical, and heroic purpose. And this is where our B-plot, our final psychological comparison, becomes so critically important. The 2 killers of Santa Cruz, Mullen and Kemper, were arrested in the same year. Both were mass murderers. But they were, psychologically, from different universes. Edmund Kemper was a psychopath. He was organized, charming, and highly intelligent. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was wrong by society's standards, and he did it anyway because he enjoyed the power, the control, and the act itself. Herbert Mullen was psychotic. He was disorganized, delusional, and tragically ill. He did not know what he was doing was wrong. In his shattered reality, he believed 100% that what he was doing was right. He believed he was saving lives. Kemper was a monster of ego. Mullen was a victim of his own collapsing brain. Tonight, we examine a puzzle. In 1993, the first Menendez jury heard a story of horrific, systematic abuse, and they could not reach a verdict. In 1995, a second jury heard a story of simple greed and convicted in hours. Same brothers, same crime, 2 completely different whys. The story of Lyle and Eric Menendez isn't just about what they did. It's about the 2 trials and the massive psychological iceberg that one judge decided to sink. As you settle in, let's explore the motive that was buried. It begins with the sound of panic. The date is August 20th, 1989. The time is 11:47 p.m. A 911 dispatcher in Beverly Hills, California, picks up a frantic call. The voice on the line is 21-year-old Lyle Menendez. He is screaming, "Someone killed my parents!" The dispatcher, struggling to understand him through the hysteria, tries to get an address. In the background, there is more noise. The sound of another person, younger, wailing in a state of utter, animalistic grief. This is 18-year-old Eric Menendez. The address is finally confirmed. 722 North Elm Drive, one of the most expensive, exclusive neighborhoods in the world. When police patrol cars glide to a stop in the sweeping driveway of the 2-story, Spanish-style mansion, they are prepared for a home invasion robbery, a mob hit, something that explains the terror in that 911 call. The front door is open. The 2 brothers, Lyle and Eric, are on the front lawn, appearing distraught, hysterical, collapsing into each other's arms. The officers step inside, into the home's den, or television room, and they are met with a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. This was not a simple murder. This was a butchering. The room, decorated in expensive, comfortable furniture, is now a war zone. The air is thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid scent of spent shotgun shells. On the large sofa, slumped in a sitting position, is the patriarch, 50-year-old Jose Menendez. He is a high-powered, millionaire executive in the film industry. He has been shot 6 times with a 12-gauge shotgun. The first shot struck his body. The final shot, delivered at point-blank range to the back of his head, had obliterated it. Across the room on the floor, in a pool of her own blood, is his 47-year-old wife, Kitty Menendez. This is the seeding of our first psychological fact. This is the overkill. The attack on Kitty was even more brutal. She had been shot 10 times. The forensic evidence showed that she had been hit first, perhaps in the leg, and had tried to crawl away. The killers had pursued her, shooting her in the arms, the chest, and finally, the face. The lead detective, Les Zoller, would later describe it as the most brutal crime scene he had ever witnessed. This was not a robbery. This was not a clean professional hit. This was rage. This was personal. The detectives, separating the grieving brothers, try to piece together a timeline. Lyle and Eric tell them a clear, simple story. It was a normal Sunday. They had gone out, they said, to see a movie. They had driven to the local Cineplex to see Batman. They even, they claimed, bought tickets at the box office, but then changed their minds and went to a local food festival, the Taste of LA. They returned home late, just before midnight, to find this horror. The story seemed plausible. The two young men, now orphaned, were wrapped in blankets by the police, treated as victims, as witnesses. In a decision that would later be heavily criticized, the police, believing their story, made a crucial error. They did not separate the brothers, and they did not perform a gunshot residue test on their hands. The public narrative of a tragedy held for a few days. The brothers, Lyle and Eric, played the part of grieving sons. They were surrounded by family. They attended the funeral. They were objects of immense public sympathy. But almost immediately, that sympathy began to curdle. Detectives, now looking at the brothers with a more critical eye, started to notice behavior that was inconsistent with profound grief. This brings us to the second, the tip of the iceberg, the narrative that would define this case in the media for the next 3 years, the spending spree. This is the seeding of our second psychological fact. This is the story the prosecution would later tell. Days after the funeral, with their parents' $14 million estate still in probate, the brothers began to spend. It was not a quiet, private spending. It was a loud, public, and extravagant explosion of cash. They had received an initial $700,000 from their parents' insurance policies, and they began to liquidate it with a speed that baffled investigators. Lyle, the elder brother, was the most flagrant. The day after the funeral, he was seen by friends not in mourning, but shopping. He bought a new wardrobe of expensive clothes. He bought a $15,000 Rolex watch, and then, infamously, wore it to his parents' memorial service. A few weeks later, he purchased a dark gray Porsche Carrera sports car. He then, in an act of sheer audacity, flew to New Jersey and bought a restaurant, a wing and pasta joint, which he renamed Mr. Buffalo's. Eric, the younger brother, was slightly more subdued, but his spending was also notable. He hired a full-time private tennis coach at $50,000 a year and began traveling to professional tournaments in Israel and Europe. Together, they rented expensive penthouse apartments, threw parties, and lived the life of newly minted millionaires. To the police, this behavior was not just suspicious, it was a confession. This was not grief, this was celebration. The why of the crime, in the eyes of the detectives, was now crystal clear. It was the oldest motive in the book: greed. The narrative was simple. Two spoiled, psychopathic sons, tired of waiting for their inheritance, had brutally murdered their parents to unlock the family fortune. The 9/11 call was a performance. The grief was a lie. And the spending spree was the truth. This was the story that the media and the prosecution would build for the next 7 months. The brothers were not victims. They were monsters hiding behind their wealth. And for 7 months, the police were stuck. They knew the why, greed, and they knew the what, the murders, but they had no how. They had no physical evidence, no murder weapons, no witnesses.
The case was stalled until Eric Menendez, tormented by a secret far darker than greed, made a fatal mistake. For 7 months, the narrative of greed was the only one. Lyle and Eric continued their spending spree, and the police watched, frustrated, unable to find the evidence to arrest them. The case didn't break because of good detective work. It broke because of a guilty conscience. Eric Menendez, the younger brother, was crumbling. He was 18 years old, and the weight of the act and the secret that preceded it was crushing him. He was a walking ghost, haunted and suicidal. In a state of desperation, he sought help. He went to a therapist in Beverly Hills, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. And in that office, in a session he believed was protected by doctor-patient confidentiality, Eric Menendez confessed to everything. He recounted the shootings, he recounted the planning, and he began, for the first time, to tell the story of why. Dr. Oziel, alarmed, convinced Eric that he needed to tell his brother what he had done. He brought Lyle into the sessions, and Lyle, confronted by his brother's confession, confessed as well. Dr. Oziel now held the most valuable secret in Los Angeles. But Dr. Oziel had his own secret. He had a volatile mistress, a woman named Judalon Smith. And in a staggering breach of ethics, Oziel told her about the confession. Their relationship soured. Smith, feeling threatened and perhaps scorned, did the unthinkable. In March of 1990, 7 months after the murders, she walked into a police station and told them everything. She told them about the therapist, the tapes, and the confession. The police had found their how. Lyle was arrested at his Mr. Buffalo's restaurant. Eric, returning from his tennis tournament in Israel, was arrested at LAX. The tip of the iceberg was now complete. The greedy sons had been caught. But when the trial began in 1993, the case exploded. The prosecution, led by Pamela Bozinich, presented the greed narrative. The spending spree, the Rolex, the cold, calculated murder for $14 million. Then, the defense, led by a firebrand attorney named Leslie Abramson, stood up, and she dropped the iceberg mass. Abramson stood before the jury and admitted it. Yes, she said, they did it. But then she told a story that was, in every way, the dark opposite of the prosecution's. She told a story not of greed, but of fear. For the first time, the world heard the testimony of Lyle and Eric Menendez. They sat on the stand, sobbing, and described a childhood not of privilege, but of profound, systematic torment. They described a father, Jose, who was not just a successful executive, but a monstrous tyrant. And they described a mother, Kitty, who was not a loving victim, but a broken, alcoholic enabler who had failed to protect them. The defense had unleashed the why that had been buried, the why of abuse. The prosecution called it a lie, a desperate, fabricated defense. But the testimony was so graphic, so detailed, and so painful that it had a profound effect. The trial ended. The jury went to deliberate, and they did not come back. They were hopelessly deadlocked. It was a hung jury. The jurors, interviewed afterward, were split. Half of them believed the prosecution's greed story and voted for first-degree murder. But the other half believed they believed the story of abuse, and they believed this was not murder. It was, they argued, manslaughter. The tip of the iceberg had been challenged. The iceberg mass had risen to the surface, and the legal system had, for the moment, broken beneath its weight. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The system was broken. The tip of the iceberg of greed was not enough to convince 12 people.
So now, we must do what that first jury did. We must retry this case, not on the basis of greed, but through the lens of the iceberg mass. We must explore the why that the prosecution tried to dismiss and the second trial forbade. This brings us to our first psychological lens, the testimony of abuse. At the first trial, Eric Menendez, the younger brother, took the stand, and for days he recounted a story that was, in its own way, as horrific as the crime scene. He testified that his father, Jose, had begun sexually abusing him when he was just 6 years old. He described in graphic, painful detail years of systematic, ongoing abuse. He described a father who was not a protector, but a predator. A man who used his immense power, his wealth, and his intimidating presence to control, silence, and violate his own son. Lyle, the elder brother, testified to his own abuse, which he claimed stopped at a younger age, but which was replaced by a different kind of torment, a brutal, psychological, and physical dominance. This was not just one act. This was, they alleged, a 12-year reign of terror. But the iceberg mass has two parts. The most complex and perhaps most tragic figure in this was the mother. This is our second lens, the enabler. The defense argued that Kitty Menendez was not the innocent victim the prosecution painted. She was, in their words, the enabler. The brothers testified that Kitty was a depressed, volatile alcoholic. They claimed she knew about the abuse, she saw it, and to protect her lifestyle, her wealth, and her marriage, she did nothing. She chose, in their words, the monster over her own children. Now, let's thuhawk our first seed. Let's go back to the crime scene, the overkill. Jose, the alleged primary abuser, was shot 6 times. Kitty, the enabler, was shot 10 times. The prosecution tried to paint this as a cold, calculated act, but the defense argued that this proves their case. This is not the action of greed. Greed is clean. Greed is a single bullet. This was rage. This was a volcanic, psychological explosion. This was 12 years of repressed, agonizing trauma exploding from the barrel of a shotgun. And the fact that they shot their mother more speaks to the deep psychological betrayal of the one person who was supposed to protect them and didn't. Now let's harvest our second seed. The spending spree, the Rolex, the Porsche. This was the prosecution's entire case for greed. But let's apply the iceberg mass lens. What if it wasn't greed? What if it was the erratic, impulsive, and profoundly dysfunctional behavior of 2 young men who, having been raised in a cult of abuse and control, suddenly had that control removed? What if, having lived for 18 and 21 years under a tyrant, they were suddenly free and had no moral compass, no understanding of consequences, no self-control? Was the spending up celebration, or was it the desperate, chaotic flailing of 2 traumatized minds trying to feel something? It is a question that complicates the simple greed narrative. And it all leads to our final psychological lens, the one the second jury was forbidden to hear: imperfect self-defense. The defense argued this was not murder. It was not manslaughter. It was a form of self-defense. Days before the murders, Eric, in a state of crisis, had finally told Lyle the full extent of the abuse. Lyle, enraged, confronted Jose. And Jose, the powerful, controlling patriarch, did not deny it. According to the brothers, he threatened them. He told them he would kill them before he let them destroy him. The brothers, raised by this man, believed him. They believed with every fiber of their being that their father was now going to kill them to silence them. Imperfect self-defense is a legal concept that states, if you honestly, but perhaps unreasonably, believe your life is in imminent danger, and you kill to protect yourself, it is not murder. The defense argued that these were not two cold-blooded killers. They were two terrified, abused children who killed because they truly believed they were next. This was the why. This was the iceberg mass that had split the first jury. So, why are they in prison for life? This brings us to our B-plot, the two trials. In 1995, the brothers were retried, this time with one judge, Stanley Weisberg. And Judge Weisberg, in a killer ruling that would seal their fate, made a decision. He decided that the iceberg mass should be reburied. He ruled that the defense could not present the majority of the abuse evidence. He ruled that they could not argue imperfect self-defense. He effectively sank the iceberg. He left the new jury with nothing but the tip of the iceberg. And a jury, when presented only with the 911 call, the overkill, and the spending spree, with no psychological context, no why for the rage, saw only one thing. They saw greed. They convicted Lyle and Eric Menendez of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The story of the Menendez brothers is, in the end, a story of Hai Fien Trois, the two trials. The first trial was a psychological autopsy, a messy, complicated, and tragic exploration of the iceberg mass of trauma. It ended in a deadlock because the why of abuse was just as powerful as the what of the crime. The second trial was a legal execution. The judge, by sinking the iceberg mass and forbidding the why, left the jury with nothing but the tip of the iceberg. And when a jury only sees two rich kids and a Rolex, the verdict is inevitable. Today, Lyle and Eric Menendez remain in prison, serving life without parole. They are now middle-aged men, married in prison, forever defined by the narrative of greed. The iceberg mass of their alleged abuse remains buried, just as it was in that second trial. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Which trial do you believe? Do you see the tip of the iceberg of greed? Or do you see the iceberg mass of abuse? It is a question that splits the world, just as it split that first jury. But for tonight, the trial is over. The mansion on Elm Drive is quiet. The arguments have faded. There is nothing left to decide. It is time to let the complexities of this case, the anger, the greed, the trauma, dissolve into the silence. It is time to let the darkness be a comfort. Turn off the lights, settle in, and let the quiet of the present moment be the only truth that matters. Sleep well.